Welcome to A View to a Grill. I'm Johnny. Today I'm going to show you my complete brisket prep routine, from unpackaging to the backyard trim to seasoning to setting up your cooker. This helps so that tomorrow morning all you have to do is light the fire and get the brisket on. And in this case, it's the Weber Kettle. First thing in our preparation is to remove it from the packaging. So let's take a look at what we're working with. Today I have a choice brisket that weighs a little more than 10.5 pounds. When removing the brisket from the package, I like to use an I-shaped cut. You can do this cut on either side of the brisket. Just be careful so that your knife doesn't score the meat while you're making your cuts. This cut will form two flaps. Just get those folded over. Once you have those flaps folded over, this is a really great time to remove some of the excess moisture on the brisket. And to do that, I like to use paper towels. Once you've patted it dry to your satisfaction, remove it from the package and set the side that you patted dry down. And now that it's out of the package, go ahead and fold the package in on itself so that you don't spill the liquid that's in the package out all over your cutting board. Now just remove the excess moisture on this side of the brisket. For me, once I have it patted dry, I like to start trimming on the meat side of the brisket. I'll just flip it over and remove some of that hard white fat on the upper edge of the brisket. This fat is known as the decal fat, and it's too hard and thick to render during the course of your brisket cook. With a sharp knife, we'll just remove it, and we'll also follow the contour of the brisket. We want to make the brisket conducive to airflow inside of the smoker. And then just kind of clean up the edges a little bit, just so that we can round it off and keep that nice shape of the brisket. Now looking from this side of the brisket, you can see that it's a nice smooth shape all the way from the point to the flat. Now that you're satisfied with the way that looks, let's take a look at some of the silver skin that's on the brisket flat. Whenever trimming the silver skin off the flat, I like to go in the direction of the grain of the brisket meat. So overall, this is a pretty good looking brisket. There are only a few spots of silver skin on this flat that I'm really concerned about, and we'll just take those right off. If your knife is sharp, you won't have any problem doing this. You should be able to just shave that silver skin right off. Now when you're done with that, just take a look at your work and see if there are any other places you think might need a little bit of trimming. Now that we're done with the top of the brisket, let's refocus on the sides of the brisket. If we take a look at this side of the brisket where the most fat is, we can see that all along the side there's this gray area on the beef, and also a lot of fat along the bottom where the fat cap is. I like to take the gray area off, and I like to remove quite a bit of this fat also. I like to start with the fat first. Now using a sharp knife, just kind of put the tip in your cutting board, angle it about 45 degrees, and if your knife is sharp enough, you can just pull and cut away that whole length of fat. So we've done that, and there's still more work to be done. So let's put the tip of the knife back on the board, angle your knife about 45 degrees, and then pull all the way across without lifting your blade. If you happen to lift it, then this is going to happen to you, just like it happened to me. All you have to do is trace back over it, cut it again, and everything will be just fine. Also, when you're trimming your fat, make sure you're angling your knife in such a way that you're creating a little bit of curvature on the side of the brisket, just for the airflow inside of my kettle. Now I'll just turn the brisket to get at a more comfortable angle and slice off this gray area on the side of the brisket. Now you want to slice it as thin as possible, but sometimes you're going to lose a little bit of the meat, and that's just the sacrifices you make when trimming your brisket. We'll just keep trimming along the sides, and remember, we don't want to scalp the brisket. I do want to keep the fat that's on top of the flat because I think the flat needs the fat. I like to keep about 1/4 of an inch of that fat cap on the flat. Now that looks pretty good. So we'll move over and get that last little bit of gray meat off the point. Now let's turn it 180 degrees and take a look at the other side. This fat is just a little bit softer, and you'll be able to see what I mean once I trim it a little bit. In this shot, you can see that it actually has layers to it. Still want to get some of that fat off just so that while it's cooking, it can render a little bit easier. I'm not going to take much of it off, just kind of shave off the side and try to maintain the shape of the brisket. Now let's take a look at the point. I'm pretty satisfied with the way this point looks, so I'm not going to do any trimming on this side of the brisket. Remember, this is a backyard trim, and I'm trying to feed my family, so I want the most yield out of this brisket that I can get. So the point looks good, we're going to leave it alone. Now let's get this brisket flipped over and take a look at the fat cap. The fat cap has these two ridges. I'm going to want to take those down, and it looks like it was scalped a little bit in between there, and the silver skin is exposed. I'm going to want to remove that. And over here on the point, I'm going to remove that silver skin also. And this is where it can get a little bit controversial about how much fat you remove from your brisket. I'm of the mind that the point has enough internal fat to keep it moist. If you prefer not to take all the fat off of the point, then you can just trim it down to whatever you like. But for me, I'm going to remove the fat off the point and the silver skin so I can get some good seasoning on there. I prefer to taste the seasoning, not the fat. And I'll start by trimming the fat off of the right side of the point all the way down to where the point ends and the flat begins. Now we'll just remove some of the fat on the side of the point, always making sure you follow a curve around the point. The very tip of the point has some silver skin that I don't want, so we're going to trim some of that off. On the top of the point, there is still some silver skin, so I'm going to trim that silver skin off with the grain. Now, if you're wondering why I trim with the grain, is because my knife doesn't tend to dig into the meat, and you don't have these divots on top of the meat. Trimming with the grain helps me prevent digging into the meat, and that's why I do that. Now that I have the point trimmed, it's time to take a look at the brisket flat and see how much fat we want to move from there. Looking at this side of the flat, it looks like there's a hump of fat here that I don't want, so I'm going to shave a little bit of that off. I'll also knock down a little bit of this fat from the point to the flat. Now we'll turn it around and take a look at the other side, and here you can see that the fat cap on this side of the flat is really thick, so that's too thick. I'm going to shave off some of that. Now when you're doing this, be careful not to dig into the meat, so if you have to run the knife over that fat with a couple of passes, then just take as many passes as you need, just so you don't scalp it and expose the meat under the fat cap. Now let's take a look at the end of the flat. Here you can see that this side of the flat is very thick and angular. I'm just going to round that off just a little bit. I'm also going to round off the thinner side of the flat. Now this will do two things. It will round it off and it'll be a nicer shape. And it's also going to remove some of that thin area on the end of the flat and make that just a little bit thicker. Now I'll take shallow cuts until I'm all the way through, and the entire time I'll move my knife in a nice rounded pattern. And this is my squirrel moment. I saw some fat that needed more trimming, so I went ahead and shaved off a little more fat in this area. Now we'll go over to that thick side of the flat where we had that hard 90-degree angle, and we're just going to round that off just a little bit for a better shape. Now let's take a look at our finished product. The point, I like the way that's looking. I like the way the fat cap on the flat is looking. The edges look nice and aerodynamic. It's contoured well. That looks good. We've got our 1/4 inch of fat all along the flat. The point side, no issues there. Now taking a look at the meat side, the silver skin is gone, but I'm going to take a little bit more off of this hump right here. So we'll just shave the top of that off. And in case you're wondering how much fat we actually removed from this brisket, it looks like we removed 1 pound, 15.3 ounces. We've removed the brisket from the packaging. We've trimmed it. Now let's get it seasoned. Today I'm using my own blend of salt, pepper, garlic powder, and onion powder. If you'd like to see how I did that, check out the link above. Whenever I'm smoking a brisket, I like to use a wire baking rack. And the reason for that is because once your brisket is seasoned, you want to handle it as little as possible so you don't disturb any of the seasoning that you put on. When you use a wire baking rack, you can then handle the rack and not the brisket. I like to season the side that's going down on the cooker. Tomorrow I'm going to be using the Weber Kettle, so we're going to start seasoning this meat side up. We're going to generously season the brisket. This is a lot of meat, so it can handle a lot of seasoning. We're going to season not only the top part of the brisket while it's in this position, but we're also going to season the perimeter of the brisket. And you'll see why in just a second. We'll get the brisket turned over. And once we get the brisket turned over and in position, then we don't want to move the brisket anymore and knock off any of that seasoning that you put on the meat side. Now we'll just run our seasoning all the way down from one end to the other. And if you've missed any spaces, then at this point you want to touch them up as much as needed. Once you have the brisket touched up with the seasoning and you like the way it looks, it's time to cover it. I'll just take some saran wrap and kind of pin it down on one end and then just layer saran wrap over it. In this case, it took 3 sheets of saran wrap. So whenever I cover it with the saran wrap, I actually go under the pan with the saran wrap. Now all we have to do is get that in the refrigerator, and that's where it's going to sit until tomorrow morning. Now that all the brisket prep is done, let's set up our cooker. In this case, I'm using the Weber Kettle tomorrow to smoke my brisket, so we'll get the Weber set up today so we don't have to do it tomorrow. In my setup today, I'm going to use the slow and sear, 3 chunks of hickory, a drip pan, and my Craycourt cast iron grill grate. I'm also going to be using Kingsford Blue, and notice that in the slow and sear, I've packed it as much as I possibly could with Kingsford Blue, but I did leave a space for about 15 to 20 briquettes. Now here where I live in Texas, it's very humid, so to keep the humidity off of my briquettes, I like to make sure that the lid is on and both of my vents are closed. Now this was my day 1 brisket workflow. This keeps me from having to do all of this the morning of the cook, and basically I can sleep longer. Now if you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching View to a Grill, and I will see you next time.